Hello and welcome to Firstpost America, your home for the biggest stories shaping the US and the world. I'm Cary, Johnston, live from the Firstpost studios. Our top story on the show today. America's threats to Iran aren't just about missiles. It's been striking with a dollar shortage bombshell. Also on the program, the US increases attacks on ISIS targets inside Syria, aiming to completely dismantle the Islamic State network. As Valentine's Day came and went, the message from Washington to Europe is less than heartfelt and more a change of relationship. And a 22-year-old Indian student is found dead in a lake near the University of California, days after he went missing. Washington's endgame in Iran has never been a mystery. It's aiming for regime change. America wants ordinary Iranians already drowning in economic misery to rise up and overthrow their own government. Even Donald Trump has openly hinted at this approach.
You want regime change in Iran?
Well, it seems like that would be the best thing that could happen. For 47 years, they've been talking and talking and talking. In the meantime, we've lost a lot of lives while they talk, and legs blown off, arms blown off, faces blown off. It's been going on for a long time. So let's see what happens. In the meantime, we have tremendous power has arrived, and additional power, as you know, another carrier is going out shortly. So we'll see it out. If we could get it settled for once and for all, that would be good.
So how does the US try to trigger a political collapse without firing a single bullet? The answer lies in something called economic statecraft. Translated, that means using money as a weapon. And according to US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Washington has done exactly that. He claims the US engineered a dollar shortage in Iran, pushing the Iranian currency, the rial, into freefall and sparking massive street protests in December. The crackdown on the protests led to the deaths of more than 6,000 people. So how did the US engineer the economic crisis in Iran? Well, a dollar shortage happens when a country does not have enough US dollars to pay for things it needs from the rest of the world. The US dollar is basically the world's main currency for trade. If exports fall and sanctions block access to the US financial system, then dollars can become scarce. As a result, the local currency weakens and prices of imported goods rise and inflation worsens. In Iran's case, the US created this shortage by hitting the two biggest pipelines that bring dollars into the country. First, oil exports. Iran depends heavily on oil revenue. The US targeted the entire oil supply chain, warning buyers and sellers that if they dealt with Iranian oil, they too could face punishment. And secondly, a banking blockade. The US effectively cut Iran out of the global financial system. Through so-called secondary sanctions, it scared banks worldwide into refusing Iranian transactions in dollars. Well, this resulted in the collapse of the rial. Last year, one US dollar was worth around 700,000 rials. In January this year, it crashed to 1.5 million, and the impact was immediate. Food prices reportedly surged by up to 72%. Iranians are now struggling to buy medicine, machinery, and essential raw materials. Local media claims the middle class has shrunk by 28%, wiping out decades of savings. But along with economic pressure comes military pressure, with the US building up its military stationed in the Arabian Sea, even as America claims to be looking for a diplomatic way out.
We're dealing with radical Shia clerics. Okay? We're dealing with people who make geopolitical decisions on the basis of pure theology. And it's a complicated thing. I mean, no one's ever been able to do a successful deal with Iran, but we're going to try. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will be traveling. I think they're traveling right now to have important meetings, and we'll see how that turns out.
Meanwhile, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent claims Iran's leaders are quietly moving their wealth abroad, calling them rats fleeing a sinking ship. And yet, analysts say Iran is a unique case. Unlike Russia, which has broader exports and bigger reserves, Iran has lived under sanctions since 1979. Well, this pressure campaign isn't new. It's just more intense. They say Iran has, over time, created a sophisticated internal mechanism to escape sanctions. This makes the dollar shortage a game of cat and mouse, as it were. Meanwhile, tomorrow, a second round of talks resumes in Geneva. Hours before the talks, Iran began military drills in the Strait of Hormuz. America wants Iran to stop enriching uranium, abandon ballistic missiles, and stop arming proxy groups in the region. Iran says it's ready for nuclear compromise if the US lifts the sanctions. The last round produced no major breakthroughs. Now, with Trump openly talking about regime change, the question is whether Iran will negotiate and how far America will go to achieve the US president's political and military aims. Well, for more on this, we're now being joined by Scott Lucas, a professor of international politics and an international affairs analyst. He's joining us live from Wicklow in Ireland. Welcome to the programme. So how do you assess the extent of the economic warfare, I should say, that's been waged by the US against Iran?
Well, the statement by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is actually more psychological pressure than it is an accurate statement. In fact, the pressure on Iran's economy from the Trump administration goes back to 2018, which is when they pulled out of the 2015 agreement to limit Iran's nuclear program. And then 6 months later, they introduced comprehensive sanctions. Now, those comprehensive sanctions have hindered Iran's oil exports, but they haven't stopped them. And in fact, contrary to what Bessent said, Iran's oil exports are roughly around at the same level as they have been throughout 2025. That's not where the pressure has come on the Iranian economy. And similarly, Iran has been cut off from the international financial system, cut off from the SWIFT transaction system since 2018. So that's not what was the catalyst for the protests that we saw at the end of last year. Rather, there, in combination with the U.S. sanctions, which had been there for years, there was the damage from Israel's 12-day war on Iran, which was quite destructive inside the country, quite destabilizing, and then it was mismanagement. One of Iran's leading banks collapsed last autumn with the loss of billions of dollars. So what you have is a story in which U.S. pressure is part of this, but it's more of this involving also pressure from Israel and also from problems inside Iran, including with the leadership. And I think that's important to note because a lot of people, especially Iran's regime, will try to get out of their predicament by saying the protests were simply caused by the United States. That way they can say that the people should rally against Donald Trump, when in fact the protests by Iranians were not caused by the United States. They were about long-standing economic and political issues with this regime going back to the late 1990s.
Right. Okay, well, it's interesting what you say then, a combination of factors, and all of this as talks are set to resume in an attempt to avoid a military conflict. I mean, how do you see these talks going?
Well, I think from the American side, it's similar to the pressure tactics that was put on Venezuela until they finally decided to kidnap President Nicolas Maduro in January. And that is, you put a military force off the coast and then you say, all right, you better talk to us. Now, in the Venezuelan case, that culminated with other members of the Maduro government giving up the president and, in effect, regime accommodation. In other words, the U.S. is still dealing with the Maduro government, albeit without Maduro. Now, with Iran, what you've got here is I don't think the U.S. is going to be able to kidnap the supreme leader. And the Iranian regime, which is a very repressive regime, a destructive regime, still is relatively intact despite the recent protest. So I'm not sure how America breaks the Iranian regime through the combination of threat and talks. But from the regime's point of view, they're playing for time. They've just survived weeks of protest by killing thousands, maybe tens of thousands of their people. They have a serious economic situation. They don't want another attack on their military and nuclear facilities, so they go through the talks. Do I actually think that's going to lead to an agreement? Highly doubtful.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's difficult to predict, isn't it? And how serious could a military conflict be for the region and indeed the world?
Well, I think it would be a case not only of causing destruction inside Iran on top of, let's say, the self-inflicted destruction that we've seen by the regime. You would have destruction throughout the region. Israel's attack on Iran did not come without cost to the Israelis, but more importantly, it threatened instability in places like Iraq, like Syria, like Yemen, like Lebanon, and even in Palestine. And I think the one thing that is probably holding the Trump administration back from simply firing some missiles on military and nuclear installations right now is the prospects that while Iran, I don't think, can directly match U.S. firepower, the consequences in other countries are so serious that Gulf states are telling the Americans, don't do this.
Scott Lucas, we very much appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you and your viewers.
The United States is turning up the heat on ISIS in Syria once again. And this time it's not a one-off strike or a warning shot, it's a sustained campaign. The US Central Command has released fresh images and details showing what it describes as an intense counterterrorism operation aimed at crushing the Islamic State network inside Syria. Well, according to the Central Command, between February 3rd and February 12th, the US carried out 10 strikes on more than 30 ISIS targets across the country. The strikes were aimed at the group's weapons storage sites, communications infrastructure and logistical hubs, basically the backbone that keeps a terrorist organization alive. The strikes were carried out using so-called precision munitions, weapons designed to destroy specific targets. The US deployed military hardware, including fighter jets, helicopters and unmanned drones, in an operation that was coordinated and intense. The Central Command described the campaign as part of its mission to maintain relentless military pressure on ISIS. The strikes are tied to a broader mission called Operation Hawkeye Strike, which has so far claimed to have killed or captured 50 ISIS terrorists and hit more than 100 ISIS targets. This latest escalation began after a deadly ambush in Syria's Palmyra. In December last year, a member of Syria's general security forces linked to ISIS attacked US and Syrian forces. It led to the killing of 2 American soldiers and an interpreter and renewed a push to hunt down ISIS cells before they can rebuild. Meanwhile, Syria itself has officially joined an anti-ISIS coalition, with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio praising Damascus for its cooperation.
So we met with the Syrian foreign minister and with the General Mazloum on behalf of the Kurds, a historic meeting, okay, together in the same meeting. Now, let me say that no one here has ever disputed that the challenge of Syria was going to be a very significant one,
The US Central Command said that its latest operation followed earlier strikes conducted between January 27th and February the 2nd, when US forces hit ISIS communications and logistics sites and weapons storage locations. But analysts say the bigger concern is that ISIS is trying to rebuild itself after the fall of Bashar al-Assad in 2024. With Syria destabilized and weapons spreading after soldiers abandoned posts, ISIS has found room to reorganize. In response, the US and its allies have taken additional measures. Just last week, more than 5,700 detained ISIS suspects were transferred from Syria to Iraq to reduce the risk of mass prison breakouts. At the same time, the US is reducing its troop presence in the country, while evacuating its long-standing base in Al-Tanf after nearly a decade. So now, as US warplanes intensify attacks from above, American troops are quietly scaling down on the ground, with the fight against ISIS entering a new and dangerous phase. Well, still to come later on the program, unlocking the padlock of stalled diplomacy as China opens its doors to British and Canadian tourists. Well, it may have been Valentine's Day over the weekend, but instead of roses and reassurance, Washington delivered a relationship warning to one of its historically closest allies, that the European alliance would continue but could no longer run on trust alone. At the 2026 Munich Security Conference, the US Secretary of State did not question the Transatlantic alliance in itself, but questioned the terms and conditions of the partnership. For nearly 6 decades, Their ties rested on one basic assumption: America leads, Europe aligns, and the system holds. Well, since the end of World War II, the US and Europe have been bound by NATO, a military alliance created to deter threats, first from the Soviet Union and now Russia. The US provided the largest share of military power, and Europe stood alongside it politically and economically, but that has increasingly become a point of tension. Take defense spending, for example. NATO countries decided to raise it by 2% in 2014. After the Ukraine war in 2022, that target became more urgent. Yet several major European economies still struggle to consistently meet that target. Meanwhile, the US remained the single largest provider of military aid to Ukraine, supplying advanced weapons, intelligence support, and financial assistance. Well, Rubio's argument in Munich was, if Europe faced the most direct threat from Russia, it should be carrying more of the burden. He implied that allies should move from being supportive partners to being equal contributors.
To engage with. We don't want Europe to be dependent. Now, we're not asking Europe to be a vassal of the United States. We want to be your partner. We want to work with Europe. We want to work with our allies. We want to work in cooperation with you. And our point has been and continues to be, the stronger you are, both on an individual basis in terms of countries and collectively as an alliance, the stronger the members of NATO are, the stronger NATO is.
Well, just a year ago at the same conference, US Vice President J.D. Vance had openly attacked Europe. He accused it of suppressing free speech and claimed its civilization was in decline. Donald Trump, too, backed Vance's comments.
Well, I heard his speech, and I tell you, you're talking about J.D.'s speech, right?
Yes, sir.
I heard his speech, and he talked about freedom of speech, and I think it's true in Europe. It's losing. They're losing their wonderful right of freedom of speech. I see it. I mean, I thought he made a very good speech, actually, a very brilliant speech. Yeah. Europe has to be careful. And he talked about immigration. And Europe has a big immigration problem.
Well, Rubio, in contrast, did not repeat those accusations, but his core idea stayed the same, that Europe is on the wrong track. Rubio also made it clear that rebuilding the transatlantic relationship would happen according to American priorities.
Under President Trump, the United States of America will once again take on the task of renewal and restoration, driven by a vision of a future as proud, as sovereign, and as vital as our civilization's past. The reason why, my friends, is because we care deeply. We care deeply about your future and ours. And if at times we disagree, our disagreements come from our profound sense of concern about a Europe with which we are connected, not just economically, not just militarily. We are connected spiritually, and we are connected culturally. We want Europe to be strong. We believe that Europe must survive.
European leaders pushed back carefully. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz argued that Europe did not need to import America's culture wars, while French President Emmanuel Macron defended Europe's right to regulate misinformation and protect its democratic systems. And while all this was happening, Ukraine remained the biggest security crisis in Europe. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reminded leaders that Russian attacks continue daily. So this was not a breakup, but neither was it a love-in. It was a message that an historic partnership alone may longer be enough for a long-lasting relationship. A 22-year-old Indian student who had gone missing in California has been found dead nearly a week after he was last seen near his campus. The disappearance of the student triggered a large search effort by police and members of the local community. Authorities later recovered his body from a lake close to the university. The Indian consulate says it's assisting the family and arranging the repatriation of his remains. The circumstances leading to his death are still being investigated. Here's our report.
On February 9th, 22-year-old Indian student Sakath Srinivasa disappeared near his university campus in California. He was a student in chemical and biomolecular engineering at University of California, Berkeley. When he failed to return to his accommodation, his roommates first searched familiar locations before approaching the Berkeley Police Department. Authorities had launched a wide search across the Berkeley Hills, and his body was found around Lake Anza. It is a quiet reservoir surrounded by hiking trails just beyond campus. Then investigators found his backpack on a doorstep near Tilden Regional Park. Inside were his passport and laptop. The Consulate General of India in San Francisco offered condolences and said arrangements were being made to repatriate him to India. In the weeks before he vanished, subtle changes had begun to surface. His roommate Baneet Singh shared a deeply personal note online, which he later deleted or made private. He described how Sacketh had grown withdrawn, eating little and disengaging from daily routines. One day, Sacketh attended class wearing a red bathrobe, and upon asking why he chose an outfit like that, Sacketh replied that he had stopped caring about appearances and expectations. The roommate also added that Sacketh was only surviving on chips and cookies. The tragedy unfolded just days after another Indian family received a similar news from another continent. In the United Kingdom, 26-year-old Vishnu Jayakumar was found dead in Coventry 3 days after he went missing, following a night out with friends. His body was recovered from a pool by the officials. Over 800 Indian students have died abroad between 2018 to 2024. This is, as per the data compiled by Insights by Dataful. 807 students died due to medical causes, suicides, and accidents, while 35 reportedly died due to violent attacks. In terms of countries, 141 died in USA, 133 in UAE, 119 in Canada, 57 in Qatar, and 56 in Australia. Separated by oceans but linked by timing, the two deaths have unsettled Indian communities overseas. Both young men had done what thousands do every year, left home with ambition, education, and promise.
And finally today, we examine a significant shift in travel policy from China. Starting on February the 17th, UK and Canada citizens will be able to enter mainland China without a visa for stays of up to 30 days. Well, the move signals Beijing's continued push to reopen to the world and recalibrate strained global relationships. China's foreign ministry says the visa-free entry will apply to tourism, business travel, and visits to family and friends. The policy is set to remain in effect through the end of the year, though it could be extended. For hundreds of thousands of British and Canadian travellers, the change removes one of the biggest bureaucratic hurdles to enter China. According to the UK's Office for National Statistics, more than 620,000 British nationals travelled to China in 2024. The move comes just weeks after Keir Starmer made an official visit to Beijing, the first trip to China by a UK Prime Minister since Theresa May travelled there in 2018. But during the visit, Starmer and Chinese President Xi Jinping agreed to ease travel barriers as part of a broader effort to stabilise relations.
And yesterday we warmly engaged and made some real progress, actually, because the UK has got a huge amount to offer, and I was able to set that out. And as a result of our engagement, we've halved the tariffs on whisky and also got visa-free travel to China for Brits. So really important access, symbolic of what we're doing with the relationship.
For Beijing, the policy aligns with a broader campaign to revive inbound travel and foreign investment, following years of strict pandemic controls and mounting geopolitical tension. For London and Ottawa, it reflects what officials describe as a pragmatic reset, but not everyone in Britain is convinced. Critics argue that efforts to warm ties with Beijing risk sidelining concerns over human rights, surveillance and national security. Just days before travelling to China, Starmer's government approved plans for a large new Chinese embassy complex in central London. A proposal that has drawn backlash from lawmakers and activists who warn it could pose intelligence and security risks. Well, the debate underlines a familiar tension facing Western governments on engaging economically with China while managing political and security differences. The development is another example of how US allies are navigating their relationships with Beijing seeking trade and economic opportunity, even as strategic competition with China continues to define global politics. That's it on the show today, but we'll be back tomorrow at the same time. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Bye-bye. The world doesn't fit in boxes, so why should your news? From battlefields to negotiation tables, from internet outrage to real-world injustice. The conversations everyone is having, and the ones they're